The horizon was a jagged seam of violet and charcoal, where the sun had bled out over the Iron Basin. This was a land of ghosts and gravel, a place where the wind didn't just blow. It scoured. Daniel sat in the shadow of his porch, the rhythmic scritch hiss of a whetstone against steel, the only heartbeat in the silence. He was a man of precise angles and few words, his frame tempered by decades of hard labor and a history he had buried beneath the floorboards of his solitude. His cabin sat on a rise, a lonely sentinel of timber and stone looking out over the endless sway of the high-grass sea. For 7 years the only voices Daniel had heard were his own, and the low guttural grumble of the thunder rolling off the peaks. He liked it that way. People were complications. They brought needs, and needs brought pain.
Tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if these Western tales make your day a little better, subscribe now. Your support keeps them coming.
He watched the sparks from his hearth dance in the reflection of his window, their fleeting light caught in the silver of his beard. His eyes, the color of cold flint, were fixed on nothing. He was counting the slow seconds of a life that felt like it had already ended. Then, the world shifted. It was a sound that didn't belong. A soft, wet thud against the wood of the stable, followed by a sharp, indrawn breath. Daniel froze. The wind was a liar, often mimicking the sounds of men. But this had a weight to it. It was the sound of something breaking. He rose with a slow, practiced grace, his joints protesting the cold. He didn't reach for a rifle. He reached for a lantern. The wick flared to life, casting long, grotesque shadows against the frost-bitten grass. The air was a razor, slicing into his lungs as he crossed the yard. Every instinct he'd honed as a scout in the old border wars screamed at him to be wary. In the Iron Basin, a stranger was usually a harbinger of violence. The stable door groaned on its leather hinges. Inside, the air smelled of dry hay, horse musk, and something else, the metallic tang of old sweat and fear. "I know you're there," Daniel said, his voice a low rumble that felt foreign even to him. He lifted the lantern. The light spilled into the corner, illuminating a heap of burlap and shadow. But the burlap moved. A pair of eyes, dark as obsidian and wide with terror, stared back at him. It was a woman, her face a map of exhaustion, her skin the color of polished mahogany. She was holding someone. Beneath her, a younger woman, hardly more than a girl, lay curled in a knot. Her hair was a tangled mane of raven black silk, and her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps. They were of the Oshana people, a tribe the newspapers said had been relocated months ago. Looking at their hollow cheeks and tattered buckskins, Daniel knew what relocated really meant. It meant hunted. The older woman, whom he would later know as Mura, didn't beg. She simply placed herself between Daniel and the girl, her chin lifted in a defiance that tranced her trembling limbs. She looked like a queen who had lost everything but her pride. Daniel's hand tightened on the lantern. He should turn them away. To harbor them was to invite the wrath of the law or the bounty hunters, who surely trailed them. But then the girl coughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed like a hammer against a coffin lid. Daniel lowered the light. The flint in his eyes softened, just a fraction. "The stove is hot," he said, turning his back to them. "The soup is better than the hay." He walked back to the cabin without looking behind him. He didn't know if they would follow, and a part of him hoped they wouldn't. But 10 minutes later, the door creaked. They hovered on the threshold, like spirits afraid to enter the world of the living. For the next hour, no words were exchanged. Daniel moved with a quiet efficiency, ladling thick venison stew into wooden bowls, and setting a tin of coffee on the table. He sat by the fire, pretending to examine his boots while they ate. They ate with a desperate, silent intensity. their eyes darting to him every time he shifted. When they finished, he pointed to the small loft above the kitchen. "There are blankets," he muttered. "Sleep." The weeks that followed were a slow dance of shadows. The Iron Basin was entering the long frost, a season where the world turned white and stayed that way for months. The three of them were trapped together yet miles apart. Danail learned their names by accident: Mora, the mother, and Leora, the daughter. They were the last of a lineage of weavers from the southern canyons. Leora was the one who began to break the silence. One morning, as Danail was struggling to mend a torn saddle cinch with frost-nipped fingers, a small calloused hand reached out and took the leather from him. Leora didn't say anything. She simply sat on the floor and began to weave the leather strips with a dexterity that made his own movements look like a bear's. She looked up at him, a ghost of a smile touching her cracked lips. "You work like a man who expects the world to fight him," she said. Her English was accented, melodic and strange in the small cabin. "The world usually does," Danail replied, watching her work. "Perhaps," she whispered, "but you can't win a fight with a saddle." Gradually, the cabin began to change. Mora, despite her failing strength, took over the hearth. The smell of scorched flour and salt was replaced by the scent of wild sage and roasted roots. She found the herbs he'd dried and forgotten, turning them into salves and teas. The silence of the cabin, once heavy and suffocating, became something rhythmic. It was the sound of Leora singing softly in her native tongue as she worked, a sound that reminded Danail of the wind through the pines, mournful but constant. One evening, as the snow piled against the windows, Mora sat by the fire, her hands resting on her knees. She looked thinner than when she had arrived, her skin translucent like parchment. "Danail," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. It sounded heavy coming from her. He looked up from the wood he was carving. "Mora, the men who came for us, they are like the winter," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "They do not hate the grass. They simply freeze it because it is their nature. We ran until the earth ran out. My husband is in the ground. My sons are in the wind." Danail felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "I was a soldier once, Mora. I know how the winter moves." "Then you know she cannot be alone," Mora said, her gaze shifting to Leora, who was sleeping in the corner, her head resting on a bundle of furs. "I am a bridge that is falling, Danail. I have walked across the sharp rocks to get her here, but I cannot walk much further." "Don't talk like that," Danail said, his voice gruff. Mora reached out, her fingers catching his sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You are a good man who thinks he is a bad one. That is the best kind of man to guard a life. Promise me, when the spring comes and I am not here, she stays, not as a servant, not as a ghost, but as a part of this land." Danail looked into Mora's eyes and saw the end of a long, brutal journey. He saw a mother's final gambit. He didn't answer with words, he simply nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. Mora passed away on a Tuesday, just as the first thaw began to turn the snow into gray slush. She died in her sleep, her face smoother than it had been in years, as if the peace she had found in the cabin had finally caught up to her. Leora didn't scream. She sat by her mother's body for 2 days, humming the song of the pines, her eyes dry and vacant. Danail stayed outside, his shovel ringing against the half-frozen earth beneath the great oak that stood 100 yards from the porch. The work was brutal, the ground resisting him at every turn, but he welcomed the pain. It was a physical manifestation of the grief he didn't know he was allowed to feel. When the grave was ready, he went inside. Leora looked up at him, her face pale. "It is time," he said softly. They buried Mora as the sun set, a fiery orange orb sinking into the mud of the horizon. Leora placed a small polished stone on the mound, a piece of river glass her mother had carried from their home. The days after the funeral were the hardest. The cabin felt cavernous. The rhythm was broken. Leora retreated into herself, moving through the chores like a clockwork doll. Danielle tried to give her space, but the sight of her standing by the oak tree every evening, her shoulders hunched against the wind, tore at something inside him. One night, as the rain drummed a relentless tattoo on the tin roof, Danielle sat at the table. He had been working on something for weeks, hiding it in the shed. He pulled a small object from his pocket and set it on the table. It was a ring, hammered from a silver dollar he had saved since the war. It wasn't perfect, the edges were slightly uneven, and the metal bore the marks of his tools, but it shone with a fierce, honest light. Leroy walked into the kitchen, her hair damp from the rain. She saw the ring and stopped. "My mother told me what she asked of you," Leroy said, her voice trembling. "She asked you to keep me, to marry me so I would be safe from the law." Daniel stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "She did ask that, and I told her I would." Leroy looked down at the silver ring. "I do not want to be a burden of a promise, Daniel. I do not want to be the price of your kindness." Daniel walked around the table. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You aren't a promise anymore, Leroy," he said, his voice cracking. "I've lived in this basin for 7 years, waiting to die. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until you started singing in this house. I'm not asking you to stay because of your mother. I'm asking you to stay because without you, the wind is just noise again." Leroy looked up at him. For the first time, the vacancy in her eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, searing vulnerability. She reached out and picked up the ring. It was cold in her hand, but as she slipped it onto her finger, it seemed to catch the warmth of the fire. "The world is still out there, Daniel," she whispered. "The men with the guns, the people who want to erase us. Let them come," Daniel said, his hand finally finding hers. His grip was steady, like the mountains behind them. "This is the Iron Basin. Nothing grows here easily. But what does grow, it never breaks." Outside, the storm finally broke. The rain turned to a soft, persistent mist, and for the first time in a decade, Daniel didn't feel the need to sharpen his knife against the silence. He had found something better than steel. He had found a reason to keep the fire burning. As the first light of a new season touched the windows, the cabin didn't just stand against the wilderness, it belonged to it. Two exiles, bound by a silver ring and a shared sorrow, watched the sun rise over a world that no longer felt quite so empty.
If you enjoy our Western stories, consider subscribing. It really helps us keep creating more for you.